Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Canadian Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Canadian race ratings, the series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with the result, and once again a win for Red Bull, their 6th in a row and another for Max Verstappen as he moves further into the lead of the championship. In behind, Carlos Sainz just couldn't quite get his first win, but a well-deserved second place, then completing the podium, Lewis Hamilton with teammate George Russell behind and Charles Leclerc in 5th, ahead of both Alpines and Alfa Romeos and Lance Stroll in 10th. Also a nice note in 8th place is Zhou Guanyu, picking up some more points after some car failures in the past few races. Now for the race itself, and one that very much ebbed and flowed in what was happening. We had the start of course, an early VSC for Perez's retirement which shook things up a bit, then another VSC 10 laps later which allowed for some more stops, unless you were Alpine and Alonso just not taking the free pit stops early. Then into the mid stint between lap 20 and lap 45 was a little bit more on the dull side, with not too much really happening. Verstappen and Sainz sort of slowly closing in on each other depending on who was ahead, but overall everyone just kind of chilling where they were. Stroll holding up people in a DRS train too, and then we had Tsunoda who just drove straight into the wall after coming out of the pits. Not much more to say on that really. But the safety car then gave us some good racing towards the end. Maybe not quite the levels of Bahrain for example, ultimately while close, Sainz never really got to make a move. So while a better finish and close cars, personally didn't think that ending was otherworldly or anything, but still good to have. Now for the ratings, and starting with you guys and what you've said from the YouTube poll, and you guys have given it a 7, which I think is generally fair. I wouldn't say it was a bad race or anything along those lines. Personally though, I've gone a little bit lower at a 6.5, while definitely some nice moments, there were aspects of not much happening, especially in that middle stint, and a number of cars struggling to pass, say Leclerc on Ocon, Zhou on Stroll, but on the whole, still one that I enjoyed and was generally glad to have Canada back. So now for teams, we'll start with Haas, and gotta be the ones who are most disappointed, started 5th and 6th and finished with a DNF and a P17. On to drivers, and a pretty quick one for Mick Schumacher, retired on lap 19, maybe 20 with some sort of issue, which was a real shame. He qualified in P6 and lost a couple off the start, but no real issues or pace to judge on, so it's going to be a not applicable rating for him. Less than 30% race distance completed and retired through no fault of his own. Then K-Mag, whose race was ruined on lap 1, making contact with Lewis Hamilton. I don't think there's anything too much in it for either driver, just a bit too close on the opening lap. But Kevin did come off worse, and ultimately, his race isn't really with the Mercedes, so maybe didn't need to be quite as aggressive as he was. Ultimately, it gave him the black and orange flag, which meant he had to come in and pit and just sort of sentence him to the back of the grid. Also, appalling strategy from Haas to not pit after that, as he went something like 60 odd laps on the hard tyres. So when it comes to rating, it is quite tricky, as a lot wasn't his fault. Ultimately though, I am going to go with a 4.5, as while yes he got sentenced to the back, it would have been nice to at least see a little bit from there. Also with the lap 1 thing, you've just got to avoid the contact and damage, even if it is a racing incident. Next up, AlphaTauri, who after Azerbaijan would probably have been hoping to get a lot more from this weekend than what they ended up with. I'll start with Gasly, who's a very interesting driver to talk about in this one, and by that I mean what to do for his rating, as while he completed the whole race, came across the line in 14th, he had car issues all race long, having to lift off and coast from the first couple of laps, which meant he never really had a chance to do much. So I think for a rating for Gasly, it's going to be a 6, just as it is very hard to tell how he actually did. To do the full race is probably worthy of a rating, plus dealing with car issues all race long. Now Yuki, and for the first half was having a really good little race. He had made his way up from the very back of the pack into the fringes of the top 10, and was making some moves to get through as well. But he did need to make an extra stop, which as it turned out would be his undoing, and I believe the technical term for the crash is just a massive facepalm, as he came out of the pits and went straight into the wall. So I think for Yuki, it's going to have to be a 3.5. He was having a decent race, maybe a 6.5 or a 7, but then to crash on his own in the way he did, it just brings the rating down. Then now Williams, and as usual only one car with any potential for a result, but it didn't really pan out for them in the end. I'll start with Latifi, as like usual there's not a ton to say. The only thing I have to note in terms of incidents was a slow stop costing him a few seconds, but before the Tsunoda safety car was 30 seconds off of Norris ahead and then around 45 to 46 seconds off of Albon. No incidents in terms of crashes, but just rating wise it's judged on the pace, and I think a 3.5 is what I'll give him. Clean, but just very, very slow. Then on to Albon, who was actually working his way into a nice position, running in 10th place at one point but yet to stop, and was very unlucky pitting before the VSC for Schumacher came out, which then meant that when all the other cars got free pit stops, he was behind them in 16th. And from there was almost 4 or 5 seconds away from the cars in front until the full safety car. So I think rating wise, it's probably a 6.5, was doing quite a nice job, doing quite well, above average for the first 20 laps, but then was sort of just out of it through no real fault of his own and couldn't make any progress from there. Next up McLaren, and really not the results they'd have liked, especially given the amount of points that rivals Alpine picked up. I'll start with Lando, who had his race undone in the pit stops as the team pulled a Red Bull from Monaco a few years ago and just didn't have the tyres ready for him. Plus you have to factor in, I believe he was losing a couple of tenths a lap with an old power unit as well, and that bad stop and the lack of straight line speed meant he was just stuck behind Albon for pretty much the entire race. However, I would say early on it wasn't looking overly impressive, and while a couple of tenths down on pace, it would have been good to see him clear Albon maybe, and so for a rating, I think it's probably going to be a 5. While a lot went wrong out of his control, I don't think he had an overly special performance himself or anything like that. Then on to Ricciardo, who had himself a very sort of quiet race with not a lot going on. Started in P9 and was still there before pitting, lost a place or two with a slow stop, and then just generally sat on the fringe of the points all race. Did make a move past Vettel for what was P10 at the time, but was eventually caught by Stroll, so while just missing out on a point, I think it's going to go down as just a very average performance for Daniel. Didn't make any inroads really, but also didn't look overly slow or anything, so rating wise it's a 5.5, pretty much smack bang in the middle. On to Aston Martin, and an extra point picked up for them, which moves them ahead of Haas into 8th place. So I'll start with Seb, who very strangely came into the pits on like the 5th lap or something crazy, which meant from there it was always going to be quite tricky getting to the end, as A, he had long tyre stints to then do, and B, the stop wasn't under a VSC like most of the grid. But with that being said, he did still manage to make some progress and pass the likes of Pierre Gasly, albeit he had some issues of his own, and was ahead of Ricciardo and Stroll towards the end but couldn't hold on with the tyres. So I think for Seb it's probably going to be a 6, it's a fairly solid drive, nothing really bad, and P12 in the end is okay. And then Stroll, who's gone from starting in 17th to picking up a point at his home race, which as a starting point has to be said is very good. Plus he did a lot of his damage by holding up people for a number of laps. You look at the likes of Zhou and Tsunoda, who were all behind him in the train for quite a while. He took the hards that he started on all the way to lap 47 to Tsunoda's safety car, and then made the one stop work. So I think for Lance it'll be a 7.5, drove pretty well, defended a lot, and yes, while helped out a lot by the safety car, so were most people in one way or another. Next up Alfa Romeo, and some points picked up for both drivers as they tried to keep touch with the likes of Alpine and then McLaren ahead of them in the constructors. I'll start with Zhou, who finally gets some points after some unfortunate races and retirements through no fault of his own, and it's sort of the performance we've been seeing but with a result this time. He made some overtakes as well, which were good to see, getting past Ricciardo early and then Vettel late. Was stuck behind Stroll for a fair amount, which did hamper his progress a little and ultimately cost him time with Bottas, but rating wise I think it's probably going to be a 7. I think he drove well, plus ended up P8 after a penalty for Alonso. Then on to Valtteri, who I think you can say for sure he had a good race. Maybe not quite on the level of Zhou, but basically there, maybe just behind. I think first off he was running behind his teammate for a fair bit, and then the thing that also frustrated me was seeing him struggle to get past Albon and the Williams, and while he did so eventually, I just get the sense that no overtakes ever come naturally to him, or maybe easily is a better word. So while he did make the one stop work very well with the safety car from Tsunoda, and finished in P7, I guess I'll give him the 7, the same as Zhou. Slightly better position, but maybe not quite as good on the race. Would have liked to have seen a bit better overtaking ability from him, but can't complain too much at the end result. On to Alpine, and while an alright result for them on the whole, given where Alonso started, maybe would have liked just that little bit more from it. I'll start with Alonso actually, and it seemed like many things just not going his way, which caused him to drop through the field. Started well and was managing to keep up with Sainz ahead and keep Hamilton behind. Then a strange decision from the team not to pit with either VSC, which may well have cost him. Plus I believe he had an engine clipping issue as well from lap 20 or so not 100% top speed. And with the late safety car was then also behind Ocon for the end stint. He did also get a 5-second penalty for weaving, which having looked at the replay is pretty slam dunk, and that dropped him from 7th place to 9th. So while I think he did drive really well when he had the car going at its full capacity, the unnecessary 5-second penalty drops his rating a point or so, meaning that it's going to be a 7.5. You know, that first stint was very good, and it was the team's decision not to use the early VSEs which cost him, plus the whole engine issues. So yeah, would have been up towards an 8.59 based on the pace in that first stint, but you add the penalty at the end and it just drops it back a little. Then on to Ocon, and the only incident I have of note for him is gaining a place on lap 1, as after the stop from the VSC he was just running in 6th, sometimes 5th for literally the rest of the race. What I will say is that while consistent and had less issues and finished higher, he did have a better strategy compared to Alonso, but less raw pace as well. However, no penalty, and the drive as a whole was a bit more complete, which means I'm going to give him the 7. Down on pace for sure against Alonso, but both Alpines had good performances, but in different ways. Next up, Red Bull, who, while taking the win, did actually come away with less points than both Mercedes and Ferrari in this one. I'll start with Perez, very quick, very easy, not applicable rating for him, causing the first VSC on lap 8 or 9, really not what he needed. I guess if there's any silver lining, it's that if you're going to DNF at a race, at least it's one where the end result isn't looking the best based on your starting position. And then Verstappen. It's quite unusual for these to have the race winner as the team that scored the 3rd highest, but I guess that was the boom or bust race that Red Bull had. For Verstappen, I think he drove really well. It would have been interesting to see how it went if there was no safety car and if Sainz was left on the hard tyres, but when we had the final stint, Max drove pretty much perfectly. Never defended when he didn't need to, was keeping up the pace, and overall very solid. Had it been Charles Leclerc behind him in the Ferrari, it may well have been a different story, but nevertheless still a very typical Verstappen performance, going to be worthy of a 9 in my book. It wasn't otherworldly like the Grand Slams that we've had this year, but still was very in control with no mistakes made and great pace throughout. Now we have Mercedes, and a very solid race for them both in terms of result and general pace, with the team doing what they have done all season long, be reliable and take what you can. I think I'll start with Russell, who cleared cars early after starting in 8th, made a couple of really nice moves into the hairpin to pass Magnussen and Schumacher, stopped under the 2nd VSC and then just before the safety car, and at that point, and even after the safety car, I remember thinking, right, both Mercs have the same age tyres, clean air with nobody really challenging them, watch the time and the gap, and it was pretty clear both before and after the safety car that George didn't have the pace of Lewis. But with that said, it is another top 5 finish and more good points. I think rating wise it's going to be a 7.5, it could be an 8, but I'm trying to avoid giving the higher rating simply on the position, as to me at least he was definitely a bit slower than Lewis, but also had the nice overtakes and a good overall finishing result. Then on to Lewis, and I do think he had a really great drive. He stopped under the first VSC, cleared Ocon, and then also cleared Alonso a little later, and when on the hards before the safety car, was setting fastest laps and was putting down times that were matching the likes of Sainz and Verstappen. Towards the end, couldn't quite keep up the pace of the front two, but was fairly comfortably ahead of George behind. I think for Lewis that was very much a mistake-free, quick drive, and also looked to have that 3rd place pretty comfortably had throughout as well. I think it's either an 8.5 or a 9, but when I compare it to Verstappen it's just behind, so gonna go with that 8.5. Mostly that high rating is based on the clear pace advantage over George, plus matching the likes of Sainz and Verstappen for portions of it too with a car that's not quite as quick. And then finally Ferrari, and one that feels strange given they've scored the most points of the top 3 teams, but will also probably be the most disappointed of the top 3 teams as well. I'll start with Leclerc, who came away with P5, and given how long he was stuck behind Ocon, and how it wasn't looking great at one point, to eventually finish 5th is a pretty good result for him. Good damage limitation on the whole. That's as a points perspective, and while he was stuck behind Ocon for a lot of the time, he never really had great tyres because he was doing the one stop. The thing that helps the performance as well was some of the moves that he did make to get past the likes of Bottas around the outside of the final chicane, and then a pair of great moves past the Alpines into the hairpin. So I think for Leclerc it's probably an 8. He made easy moves and good moves too, but did get a little bit stuck at times, and had it not been for that safety car at the end, I don't think he'd have finished as high as 5th. Then on to Sainz, and arguably one of his best races of the season. Didn't look to quite have the pace of Verstappen early, but as the race went on, he really did, especially after that safety car. Admittedly on fresher tyres, but he did put the pressure on, and if the driver in front wasn't Max Verstappen, may well have taken the win. I think pace-wise he drove well, obviously tricky to tell with no Leclerc there to compare with. One little blip I'd say is not really pulling away from Alonso early on, but he did have the better pace at the end to make up for it. So rating-wise, I think it's going to be an 8.5, would be a 9, but did have 2 safety car stops compared to Verstappen's 1, along with the fresher tyres at the end, which he couldn't quite capitalise on. So that rounds out the ratings for the Canadian Grand Prix. I think generally was a case of drivers at the top did the best and didn't make mistakes. Not the most incredible race, but not a complete bore fest either. And then for the updated standings, no changes higher up, but jumps for Alonso and Carlos Sainz, with the biggest mover downwards unsurprisingly being Yuki Tsunoda after his unprompted crash after having just come out the pits. Anyway, that is all for now. As mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below. But until next time, take care.